Hello and welcome to the sixth video of our YouTube series C# for Unity. Today we're going to talk about the scope of a variable. Every variable has a scope in which it is existing. That means that the variable will always exist within a code block. A code block is always started with an opening curly bracket and ended with a closing curly bracket. A variable that you declared in a code block is only existing in this code block and will be destroyed after the code block ends. A variable can only be mentioned or used in the code block in which it was declared. And I'm explicitly saying declared. I'm not saying initialized because it doesn't matter where the variable was initialized, but it matters where the variable was declared. The variable can only be used in the code block in which it was declared. But a code block can also contain another code block or multiple other code blocks. Or it can contain a code block that contains another code block. That means if you declare a variable in a code block that contains another code block, then this variable can also be used inside the other code block. A code block contains another code block if the closing curly bracket was done after the definition of another code block. I know this may sound a bit confusing for now, but the concept itself is pretty easy and you will get it very soon. For example, if we have this big code block that we started with the definition of our class, then this code block contains the code block of the definition of our method start. But don't get confused here. If you declare a variable inside our method start, it only exists inside our method start. I know the method start is part of the block of code that we defined with our class YouTube, but the method start is not containing that block of code. No, it's the other way around. The class YouTube is containing the block of code that has to do with our method start. But our method start is not containing the block of code that we defined for our class YouTube. That means only if you declare a block of code that contains another block of code and you create the variable outside the other block of code, then you can also use this variable inside the block of code that your block of code is containing. So let's stop with all these confusing theoretical terms for now, so I can give you an example that makes all these things that I just said way clearer to you. So if I declare this variable called number in our class YouTube up here, I can access this variable in our method start, because our method start is contained in the code block of our class YouTube. Of course, if I put number here in our start method, then it's part of the code block from our start method, and then of course I can also debug log number in our start method because it's the scope of our start method. If I put number here or declare our variable number here in the start method, that's what we call method scope. If I put the variable declaration in our class up here, that's what we call class scope. So why do we call it class and method scope? That's very easy, because if we declare our variable up here in our class YouTube, then everything inside the class YouTube can access this variable. Everything inside this class can access this variable. And that's why it's called class scope, because everything inside the class can access this variable if we declare it up here inside the class on the class level, inside the code block of the class. And if we would put our variable declaration inside our method start, then everything inside the method start can access this variable. That's why we call it method scope. Everything inside our method where we declared the variable can access this variable. So if we put a variable inside a method and declare it on the start of the code block, for example, of the method, then everything inside this method can access the variable. And that's what we call method scope. To show you an example, I want to write this method here. I call it this won't work because this won't work, obviously. So if I write number here, you can see I can't find the variable number because I declared it inside the start method, but not inside the this won't work method. If I would have declared number inside our class YouTube, then it would have worked and I could access number from this method, this won't work. But because I declared it inside the start method, I can't access the variable number inside this method here. And that's why I explain this topic so detailed, because it's so important to notice that this code block here is the context of number right now. The context of number is this code block that we started with the predefined method start. But this code block here is not part of the context for number right now. And that's why we can't access number here, because it's not part of the context where number is available right now. If I want, I can declare another variable here called number as well. But those two variables, the variable here that I declared now, number, and the variable that I declared inside the start method, have nothing to do with each other. The values have nothing to do with each other. So those are just two completely different variables, and that's very important to notice. If I would, for example, create another code block here. Yes, you can also just create code blocks without any method or class. You don't need that for creating a code block. So if I create another code block here by opening a curly bracket and closing a curly bracket, and I declare a variable of type int called var block scope here, I can't access this variable outside this block. So for example, I can access this variable inside this block here with debug log var scope, block scope, but I can't access it outside this block with debug log var block scope, because as you can see here, it will be underlined red because it can't find this variable outside the code block that I declared it in. And this is what we call block scope in Unity. Block scope just means exactly that. The variable is only accessible in this code block and not outside of this code block. If I would delete this code block here, then this variable would become part of the method scope of the method start. So I can rename it to method scope, and this variable is available in the whole method start. If I now move this variable to the class up here, I mean it is already in the class, but right now it's also in our method. So if I move it out of the method and inside only the class, then it would be class scope, and it would be available in the whole class. But it would not be available in another class. It would be only available in our class YouTube, but it would not be available in our class dog, for example. As you can see, it won't work. It underlines the variable red because it can't find this variable for the class dog, because the class dog has its own code block, and inside this code block I never declared the variable class scope. The variable class scope was only declared in the code block below, which is part of our class YouTube, but it's never declared inside the class dog, so the class dog can't find this variable. As you can see, this block of code that I marked right now is the block of code where our variable class scope is accessible, and as you can see, we tried to access the variable class scope from a point outside of this block of code, so it won't work. Okay, that's it for today. Sorry, I know I was very detailed and I often repeated myself, but this is a topic that is often not correctly understood or misunderstood by many beginners, and therefore I wanted to make sure that everything is perfectly clear. I hope you learned something about method scope, class scope, block scope, and scope in general, and I see you for the next video. Welcome to the end of this video. Hit the subscribe button to stay updated. Also, if you need some high quality assets for your game or like our channel and want to support us, feel free to check out our assets at the Unity or Unreal Asset Store. You'll find the link to our store pages in the description. I hope you learned something new and see you next time.